Winter had a way of quieting the world until even a man's heartbeat felt too loud. On that dusk-laden evening, the snow drifted in slow, thoughtful spirals, settling on the shoulders of Silas Boone as he rode along the frozen trail that traced the edge of Willow Creek. His coat, patched in more places than he cared to admit, billowed in the wind like an old flag that had survived too many storms. The land lay still before him, a white, breathless plain, where sound seemed afraid to wander. Silas welcomed the hush. Silence was kinder than people. Kindness didn't come naturally to the folks of Mariner's Bend when his name was spoken. They said he carried misfortune, that sorrow clung to him the way frost clung to winter grass. Some whispered that even the horses sensed it, stepping back when he entered the livery barn. And Silas, worn and hollowed by years of drifting through ranches that never quite became home, never found the words or, perhaps, the courage to contradict them. He had learned long ago that when a man's past casts a long shadow, folks prefer to stay in the sun. His boots felt heavier than usual in the stirrups, as if the memories he kept refusing to bury had worked loose and now tugged at him with icy fingers. His sister's face rose in his mind, not as she'd been on warm days, laughing and bright-eyed, but as she'd been the night the blizzard swallowed her. 17 years had passed, yet the guilt was still fresh enough to sting. He hadn't held tight enough, hadn't pushed hard enough through the storm, hadn't saved her. He couldn't change that truth, but it followed him like a ghost tied to his ribs. Up ahead, a faint glow spilled from a small cabin window, the only light for miles. Maeve Hartwell lived there, just off the trail, in a home built with her late husband's hands. Silas had passed the place many times without stopping, but last night she had waited on her. Porch with a steaming bowl of stew and a gentleness that unsettled him more than any insult ever had. He didn't understand why she offered anything to a man the town preferred to avoid, but she had pressed the bowl into his hands without expectation, without judgment, and the warmth of it had seeped into places he thought long frozen. Tonight, he didn't plan to stop. He didn't dare linger near the one soul who seemed to look at him and see something other than a walking omen. Connection, in his experience, never stayed gentle for long. As he guided his horse past the cabin, a gust of wind carried a faint sound to him, so soft he thought it might have been the creek settling its frozen crust. But then it came again, fragile and trembling, a sound too alive to be the shifting ice. Silas stiffened. The horse pawed the ground nervously, ears flicking. He slid off the saddle, steadying himself against the biting cold. The sound drifted from farther down the bank, almost swallowed by the wind. He moved toward it, each step sinking into powdery snow that tried to pull his boots down. The cold cut at his face like a blade sharpened on winter's stone as he reached the creek. He saw movement in the water, 3 small shapes caught between shards of ice, bobbing in the sluggish current. At first, his mind couldn't make sense of it. The sight was too unreal, too cruel. But when one of the bundles shifted and a thin wail escaped, the truth struck him in the chest so hard his breath faltered. Babies, 3 of them. Newborn, helpless, wrapped in soggy scraps of cloth that clung to their tiny forms like wilted petals. Silas's vision blurred. He blinked hard, and for one terrifying heartbeat he saw his sister, their small, cold, fading. But the water splashed again, snapping him back to the present, to the urgency of lives slipping away in the pale arms of the creek. He didn't allow himself a second thought. The cold hit him like a hammer the instant he stepped into the water. The shock tore a ragged breath from him, but he pushed forward, ice clawing at his legs as if trying to pull him under. The creek wasn't deep, but its bite was merciless. Every inch felt like needles sinking into his flesh. He reached the first bundle and lifted it carefully, tucking the trembling child into his coat. The baby's skin was blue-tinged, breaths shallow as whispers. Silas murmured to the tiny form, not even aware of his own shaking voice. With numbed fingers, secured the baby against him and turned back for the others. The second bundle drifted, dangerously close to a jagged edge of ice. Silas lunged, slipping on the slick stones beneath, pain shooting up his knee. He forced himself up again. He would not let the creek take this child. He caught the bundle against his chest, cradling it as urgently as a prayer. The third lay farther downstream, spinning slowly in a widening pool where the ice had thinned. Silas's breath burned, his limbs stiffening from the cold, but he would not stop. Each step became a battle with the freezing water, his muscles screaming in protest. He reached the last bundle just as it tipped sideways, as if surrendering to the icy pull. "Not today," he gasped. Grabbing hold with both hands, by the time he staggered out of the creek, his legs felt like stone pillars ready to shatter. The babies in his coat were eerily quiet, too quiet, and terror surged through him with a force that almost brought him to his knees. He pressed them closer, sharing what little warmth he had left. The wind howled across the plain. But Silas Boone moved with a steadiness, born not of strength but of desperation, and a memory he refused to repeat. The world blurred as he half stumbled toward Maeve's cabin. The lantern in her window, glowing like a small sun in the frozen dark, he reached the porch and pounded on the door with his elbow. Voice raw and broken. Maeve opened it at once. The lantern's golden spill revealing her hair braided loosely over her shoulder, and her eyes widening as she took in the sight of him, soaked, trembling, cradling the impossible. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. Her hands, warm and sure, lifted one of the babies from his coat with a tenderness that cracked something deep inside him. "Bring them in." Pulling him out of the cold inside. The air was thick with heat from the wood stove, fragrant with pine. Maeve set the baby on a quilt-lined table and motioned for Silas to lay the others beside it. She moved with quiet, focused urgency, warming water, layering blankets, checking their breaths with a steady resolve. Silas watched, numb, as she tended to each fragile life. "I found them in the creek," he managed, voice hoarse. Maeve's eyes lifted, full of sorrow and something like fierce protectiveness. "You saved them, Silas." He shook his head, unable to accept praise, unable to believe he'd done anything more than arrive moments before tragedy cemented itself. "No," she murmured, brushing her hand lightly against his soaked sleeve. "You did?" The touch was brief, almost accidental, yet it cut through him with startling warmth. She didn't look at him like he was cursed. She looked at him like he mattered. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, 3 small chests rose and fell with growing steadiness. Silas let out a breath he'd been holding since the moment he stepped into the freezing water. For the first time in many years, something inside him thawed slowly, uncertainly, like ice breaking at the first hint of spring. Yet as the babies whimpered faintly, as Maeve wrapped them in fresh cloth and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of new life, Silas couldn't shake the chilling truth that someone had left them there on purpose. The creek had tried to steal them, but the night had given him just enough strength to pull them back. And though warmth wrapped the room, a shadow lingered at the edge's quiet, waiting, hinting that the world beyond this cabin had not yet revealed its darkest part. Morning broke slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to cross the threshold of a world that had nearly let 3 babies die in its frozen arms. A pale light spread across Maeve's cabin, settling over the small bundles resting near the stove. Their breaths were steadier now, small puffs of life rising into the warm air. Silas Boone, seated beside them with a blanket around his shoulders, felt exhaustion gnaw at him, but he refused to close his eyes. Each breath the infants took felt like a quiet victory he needed to witness. Maeve moved softly through the cabin, careful not to disturb the fragile peace. She set a cup of coffee, thick, strong, steaming on the table beside him. Her fingers brushed his for just a moment, the briefest touch. Yet it anchored him more firmly than the chair beneath him. "You should rest," she murmured. "I will. Just not yet." His voice was rough, as if the creek's icy grip still clung to his throat. Maeve didn't argue. She understood without needing to pry. She seemed to carry an instinct for pain that didn't want to be named. When Sheriff Emery Colt arrived, his knock rattled the door. Maeve opened it cautiously, and the sheriff stepped in, brushing snow from his coat. His gaze went first to Silas Pell, shivering, clothed stiff with frost, and then to the babies. His breath caught. "Dear Lord," he whispered, removing his hat. Found them in the creek, did you? Silas nodded, unable to muster more than that. Sheriff Colt studied him for a long-waited moment. Something in the lawman's expression shifted respect, disbelief, maybe both. But the sheriff's presence also meant questions. And questions meant the fragile peace in the cabin was about to fracture. Silas told him everything. The faint cries, the shapes drifting, how the water nearly took him to his knees. Maeve stood nearby, hands clasped tightly as if holding her breath for Silas each time he paused. When Silas finished, the sheriff rubbed a hand across his jaw. There were riders seen near the river last night. Lyle Branson and 2 of his men. The name hung in the air like a cracked bell. Maeve straightened slightly. Silas felt something cold slide down his spine, unrelated to the creek. Lyle Branson was a man whose conscience had long gone dry. A ranch foreman with a hard reputation. The sort of man who believed the world owed him comfort, but no one else deserved the same. If his men had anything to do with the abandoned babies, then the story wasn't just tragic, it was monstrous. Can't prove nothing yet, Sheriff Colt said, voice low. But those tracks by the creek trail lead toward his old shack. I'll be heading there soon. Silas understood the unspoken request. The sheriff didn't say come with me, but his eyes did. Colt trusted Silas's instincts when the land turned quiet and cruel, and whether Silas wanted it or not. He'd been pulled into this the moment he stepped into that creek. Maeve touched Silas's arm gently, stopping him before he rose. If you're going, she said, I'll wrap the little ones warm and keep the fire high. But please, don't go alone. He saw the truth behind her words, the worry she tried to hide, the tremor at the edge of her voice. She had known enough loss to recognize the shadow of danger when it approached. Silas nodded. I'll ride with the sheriff. Maeve didn't speak again. She simply tied a thick wool scarf around his neck, tugging it snug in a gesture so intimate it left him breathless. Her fingers lingered for the smallest heartbeat before falling away. Silas felt the warmth of that moment long after he stepped outside. The snowstorm had mellowed, but the cold still bit at them as Silas and Sheriff Colt rode toward the abandoned shack. The sky hung low and gray, casting a muted pall over the land. Their horses' breaths rose in clouds that drifted behind them like fading secrets. Tracks from the night before were half buried under fresh snow, but still visible enough to follow. As the shack came into view, a sense of unease thickened the air. Smoke rose from the crooked chimney. Unwelcomed, Sheriff Colt signaled for silence. They dismounted and approached with careful steps. Voices drifted from inside, angry, frustrated, laced with panic. You said no one find out, one of the men snarled. I said they should have sank. Lyle Branson shot back, tone icy and unrepentant. Didn't think some fool'd go swimming through winter water? Silas's jaw tightened. Sheriff Colt stepped forward and kicked open the door. Hands where I can see 'em. Chaos erupted. One man scrambled for the back window. Another reached instinctively for the table where a pistol lay. Lyle lifted his rifle halfway before freezing under Colt's steady aim. Drop it, the sheriff warned. Lyle's upper lip curled. They weren't mine. Weren't our problem. You can't pin this 3 newborns left to die in a creek, Colt snapped. I can pin plenty. Silas stood just behind the sheriff, eyes fixed on Lyle, their gazes locked, and Lyle smirked cold. Twisted thing. Should have known Boone to be involved somehow, Lyle sneered. Man's cursed. Trouble follows him like a stray dog. Silas felt the old wound slit open. But before the words could cut deeper, Maeve's voice echoed faintly in his memory. You did save them. And somehow, that was enough to steady him. Trouble didn't follow me, Silas said quietly. You left those children to die, Lyle scoffed. They were dead weight. Their mama died birthing M. Nothin' but mouths to feed. Silas stepped forward, the cold outside nothing compared to the frost hardening inside him. They were breathing. They were crying. They were human. You made a choice to silence them. The shack seemed to shrink around them. Even the wind outside paused. Sheriff Colt moved swift and sure, cuffing Lyle and his men while Silas stood there, pulse pounding, breath shaking. It wasn't anger that consumed him, it was something deeper, a fierce, protective surge that surprised him with its strength. The same force that had driven him into icy water now settled like fire in his chest. When they returned to Maeve's cabin, the snow had begun to lighten, sunlight pushing its way through a thinning cloud bank. Maeve met them at the door, the babies bundled against her, their tiny faces warmed by the hearth's glow. Her eyes swept Silas's face, searching for injury. When she found none, relief softened her expression. She stepped closer, handing one of the babies to him with quiet trust. The child blinked up at Silas, small lips parting in a faint sigh. As if recognizing the man who pulled them back from the darkness, Sheriff Colt explained everything: the confession, the arrests, the grim truth of the mother's death. Maeve listened in silence, her fingers trembling just slightly as she held the youngest twin. Grief passed through her expression, but so did resolve. "These babies need someone," Colt said, his voice gentler than usual. "Someone who'll care for them proper. We'll put it before the town council, but we'll need volunteers." Maeve looked at Silas, then not uncertain, not hesitant, simply honest. "They can stay here," she said softly. "If Silas helps?" Silas felt his heart stutter. For a moment, he didn't breathe. He had expected gratitude, perhaps kindness, but not this. Not an invitation. Not a place in someone's life. Not a future shaped by more than wandering regret. Maeve stepped closer, adjusting the scarf she'd tied around him earlier, fingers brushing his collar. It wasn't a confession, nor a promise, only a gesture, simple and unadorned, yet filled with more meaning than any words could carry. Silas nodded, unable to speak. Something inside him, something frozen for years, finally cracked open. The sheriff left them with a quiet smile, and the cabin settled into a gentle quiet. Snow glimmered outside like softened glass, reflecting the slow rebirth of hope unfolding within the wooden walls. Silas stood beside Maeve, watching the babies breathe, watching their tiny fingers curl and uncurl, as if testing the world they'd nearly been denied. He felt Maeve's shoulder brush his, a brief, warm contact that steadied him just as deeply as the fire warming the room. He had saved 3 lives. But in doing so, something in him had been saved too. Not entirely, not perfectly, but enough to begin again. Yet even as peace filled the small cabin, the world outside remained wide and uncertain. The choices ahead, their future, the town's judgment, the lingering shadows waited like untouched snow. But for the first time in years, Silas Boone didn't fear the steps he'd have to take. He had something to walk toward now, and though the story of these children, this winter, and the quiet bond forming between him and Maeve was far from finished. The night's cruel beginning had given way to a morning that felt almost like grace.